Hey, welcome to the process. My name is Dr. John Bush. This is lesson 85. We're in the beginning of a big block of video lessons on positional targets. And this is part two, starting to look at the running backs, and everything's designed to help you win your fantasy football drafts for 2021. And I think it's a pretty good way to slowly chip through the process, build your database, and then you go for it there. And let's start it off, see what we got here. So we're doing running backs here. And first chart is looking weekly versus years, and I looked at 2015 right here to 2020, week 1 through 17. I wanted to answer the question, does the targeting of running backs change over the course of a season? Does it go up? Does it go down? Is there any kind of quote pattern that might be of use for us? So that's why I developed this. And again, this is looking at all running backs, not just the top running backs here. So across all the listed running backs that had a target, and I took the total targets divided by the number of running backs at that position bi-weekly from week 1. So average W1 means in TGT is targets, so it's average of week 1 targets all the way to average week 17. And I colorized the highs and lows here, and I think what jumped out to me, and we've talked about this in the previous lesson, was that 2020 was a really rough year for targeting the running backs as a group here. And if you see 2020, and it's probably, I'm guessing, COVID related, okay? But I know targeting went down as well. We talked about that in the previous lesson. And we can see that some of the 6-year lows occurred in 2020 here. If you look at 1.9, 1.82, this is the second lowest, third lowest, low, low, and you can see it across. So it is across the board. 2020 declined in running back targeting. Was this response to COVID? It may be something about that not every running back, and we talk about this when we talk about handcuffs, that, it's the next man up. Well, maybe the next man up is not as good as pass catcher out of the backfield. There may be a certain skill set that is just, if you're stepping in for some injured player, you may not have had time to work on that skill set. And maybe the coaches and whatnot have concerns about that and just call for less targeting of running backs out of the backfield here. So, I'm not sure what that is, but I see the data and it's pretty clear to me. 2018, by the way, was kind of the opposite of 2020. It was one of the best years for running back targets here. And as I look across, if you look here, 1918, 1918, and then you look at, say, 1.7, 0.6, 0.7, it looks to me like there is a decrease, at least in 2020. Looks like it went down a little bit as the season wore on. So that may have been the COVID or whatnot, may have been running out of pass catching running backs at the end. Just I did notice that trend. But I like to see, the visual side. Am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? And there's a lot of dots here and lines and whatnot. So let's kind of go through this. This is running back targets versus seasonally weeks, 2015 to 2020. So week 1 to week 17. And what I did was I colorized 2018 and beyond back with yellow dots here, and really didn't follow the trend. I just plotted those. The trends I was interested in was the last 2 years, 2019, 2020. So that's blue and a green here. And then I developed the trend lines here, polynomial trend lines. This is 2019 in blue. And we can see, looks like kind of like a roller coaster, doesn't it? And it looks like weeks 7, 8, 9, it drops. And then we see another kind of a peak at 13 and then a drop again. And notice it's dropping in the key playoff weeks. Isn't that interesting? And lo and behold, the trend for 2020 was lower, maybe COVID, less target. But notice we saw a drop, not as steep of increase, but a drop again. So 2020 was much more dynamic. That by end of week 7, we were in kind of the lowest, take a look, lowest time for running back targeting here versus the preceding weeks. And even in 2019, we had 2 peaks, but a valley and a valley. So just be aware, and I don't know if people have noticed this or not, but I think there might be that tendency. And so just be aware that in the playoffs, the pass catching running backs may be seeing less work as a group. This is not individual. I'm looking at giant trends here. So if you look at big trends, you'll see things that, if you look too close, right, it's the forest and the tree concept here. You're missing the big picture here because you're staring at 1 or 2 trees versus the whole forest. And that's why the metrics data, the way I look at it, I think gives me an advantage that people or others are just missing, don't want to do it. I don't, haven't done it. Being a scientist, this is kind of stuff we look for, right? We try to figure out and puzzle through data. Okay, been doing that, since the 1970s. As I was getting trained as a scientist. So I've had many of years experience, and no offense to anybody out there, not sure they've had a lot that, had that kind of background here. So anyway, that's what I'm seeing, and it was exacerbated potentially in 2020. So I'm a little concerned that we might be seeing the best out of our pass catching running backs early in the season and then a decline. So I guess if I'm a trader and players, maybe that's what I trade. Running backs that are pass catchers, say after week 7 or 8. Okay, try to get something better. So I'm assuming that if the targeting for running backs is going down, that maybe there's higher rushing amounts. And maybe I'll, if I get time this year, I'll look at that and see if that balances out what's going on here. But just be aware. Oh, and by the way, the pink or red line is the 6-year average. And we see a high, lows, and the average, however, has been kind of an increase in the last few years. So they haven't seen that second dip. But the first dip has been seen in all 6 years. If you look at the 6-year trend line, it's just in recent years we've seen that playoff dip here in running back targets. So just be aware that's out there. Okay, so that's kind of something people probably are not thinking about. So I wouldn't want to rely on pass catching running backs to save my season in the playoffs. Okay, just be aware that's what the data is showing us last couple years. Another aspect to looking at data is an average versus variation within each sample point. So within each week, how much variation is it amongst all the running backs? Okay. So if you think about it, the more variation, the higher the uncertainty. Okay. And so it gets a little trickier to deal with. And let's see what we're seeing. So the red dots are the average over the 6 years, and the yellow dots are the weekly variation. And then the trend line is the average, weekly averages here. Looking across, we see kind of that dip. And again, the 6-year average, we see it increase at the playoff. And I showed you 19 in the year 2020. We didn't see that, but if you look at all the data over the 6 years, there has been an increase. But notice the variation takes a dip, but then during the time when we need more, shall we say, more understanding and to win our leagues, we actually get more variation occurring later in the season. So the variation drops and gets a little more predictable. And then about week 13 or so, over the last 6 years, we've seen an increase in the variation. And notice early in the season, there's a nice bit of variation because teams are figuring out who they got and what the schemes are. So we see a pocket of variation early, dropping, and then increasing variation, probably injury, maybe, like I said, new people catching out of the backfield due to injury, and other kinds of maybe rookies coming on. Just be aware that if you think of the season, it's not one act. It's probably multiple acts, right? Like a play. Things are happening early, middle, late. And so what you saw in Act 1 may not, is probably different than in Act 2 or 3. So just keep that in the back of your mind too, that the flow of the season, it can be different as well. Now, you don't hear a lot of people talking about that. I mean, when I say that, I really mean I hadn't heard anybody talking about that. I don't know what they're doing out there. So-called analysts, claim to be looking at metrics. I don't know. What are they doing? I shouldn't be doing this. I wish somebody else would do this for me, right? It's like, this is no fun. I would rather just have the data and let me look at it. Yeah, now that would be fun. Somebody else do this for me. Now that's fun, okay? Because I got other things to do besides generate patterns and data and think of it. I just want to let somebody else generate the trends for me, and I'll study the data. But unfortunately, I don't find it out there, so I have to do it myself. Come on, folks. Somebody get out there and do this. Okay? Don't want to do this every year. Okay, next. So, I also looked at the team level. So I wanted to ask some questions about the team level over 6 years. Uh, I understand players, coaches, things are changing, but there are some things that stay maybe the same in groups and in teams. And it's just, again, it may not be something we can use, but I like to see the data anyway. Again, teams that play outside, maybe there's weather factors, and that's kind of part of the season. I don't know. But anyway, we have the position is the running back. The team is shown here. And I'll show you why Pittsburgh is at the top and San Francisco's at the bottom here. Average of total targets over the 6 years, and I've colorized. Green is high and red is low, so we can see the highs and lows over the 6 years. And then I asked, and so if you just look at these numbers, here's 27, here's 23, and it's like, well, what does that really mean? Well, if you do a scaled target, scaled to the league average, what does it mean? Well, 23 is about average, so that doesn't mean, Pittsburgh is about average. Okay, but notice the Chargers, 5.8, that's above league average. Look at New Orleans. Probably not surprising when I taste one of these facts like, oh yeah, I told, oh, I knew that. Well, did you really know that, or you just want to believe that you knew that? Okay, there's, think about biases and whatnot. But the data actually confirms that New Orleans has done a lot of passing to its running backs over the last 6 years. In fact, they have led the league. If you look at the 6-year average, 7.3 above average. Wow. In the scale target. That's really amazing. So versus, let's see, the worst is what? Seattle. Come on, Seattle. So that sucks. So you always think if you're drafting Seattle running backs, you better get rushers, because looks like they don't want to pass to their running backs out of the backfield. Maybe Russell Wilson doesn't want to do that. Maybe he's not as good. Maybe their schemes haven't been designed to do that versus New Orleans. Okay, it's good to know that. I think you get some aspects on schemes here. Buffalo, -7. Come on, Buffalo. You can do better than that. So you can look across and see who's high and low. And then I also generated average of targets per game. So I took the total targets divided by the number of games, 16, and you got a number. And I sorted and colorized the team's name by this average of targets per game. Okay, so you can see who have been very active and who have not been active. Again, this is over 6 years. So what teams have changed recently? That's something to consider. I can tell you Washington has changed, and they're doing a lot more passing out of the backfield. But here's the beginning. This is the foundation to start our research here. Especially in PPR, it's always good to draft running backs that can catch. That adds to their luster in the draft if they can catch out of the backfield. But anyway, there's the actual teams and category from high, above average, below average, and low. Okay, so here you can come back and look at this data. So here's running back 2015 to 20, average of total running back targets, scale targets, and targets per game. So basically I just visualized all the data in the chart, but I like a visual aspect to it. And we have the teams from high to low, targets per game, Pittsburgh to San Francisco, high to low. And average total targets, red. Okay, so we see different, here's Seattle, one of the lowest. Okay, Houston, low. Okay, New Orleans, very high, and we talk. So you can see the highs and lows. They stick out above the crowd or below the crowd. And then the yellow, anything above 0 is better than league average, and anything below 0 is below league average. So Seattle, you suck. Kansas City, come on. Buffalo. But here's New Orleans. Here's the Chargers. Cincinnati. Cleveland's done well. The Jets. Las Vegas. San Francisco hasn't done so well. So you can get a feel. And then finally, I did average of targets per game in blue. And you can look high to low. So right to left. So I would stare at this and think and try to basically try to memorize it if you can. That's what I would do. If you work with enough data, you end up thinking about it and you remember it. So that's what I'll do. This is my process. May not be your process. It's my process. Okay. So, as I said, it's nice to see 6 years, but what about the last couple? What's going on? What have you done for me recently, right? So, I generated this data, running backs, the team, and we'll talk about the sorting. 2019, average targets per game. 2020, average targets per game, and difference. So what teams have really been doing things differently, high versus low? So now we see Buffalo, Detroit, Indianapolis, San Francisco, and Philadelphia have all increased passing out of the backfield from 19 to 20. Nice. And so I sorted by the difference. So Buffalo, Detroit, Indianapolis, San Francisco, and Philadelphia. I shaded deep blue. That's the high. Red is the low. And poor New Orleans, they've had a great 6 years, but 2020 was a sucky year for passing. So I know Kamara's going high, but just be aware, last year they were the worst team in difference. So is Kamara overrated? I'm drafted him early, sure, but I have more concern about him this year than ever. One of the reasons is this. Another reason is, not having Breeze there. Okay. And that, I think Breeze's last year, he wasn't obviously the same. And I worry about the stress on Kamara, his age. I just worry about injury. I think his injury potential is higher than it's ever been. I think about New Orleans is going to be a lot more stressed getting used to whatever scheme they're going. So I would definitely, if I'm drafting Kamara, I'm getting Murray as a backup. That's a gotta have. Okay. Chargers without Eckler sucked. So maybe Eckler bounces them back. Pittsburgh, they got rid of Connor. Got a rookie. Can he do something? I don't know. Everybody thinks so. They sure drafted Harris early. Carolina, CMC, are you back? You going to help us move up? Cincinnati didn't do too well last year with Mixon. Tampa Bay decreased. So look at these teams as you go up and down and think about what they've done last year, the difference between the previous year, 2019, and what does it mean for this year? You can't take this, as gospel, but you take this as the beginning and a tendency until your research says different, right? Okay? So, for instance, Carolina's at the bottom, but I assume that will change with a healthy CMC. Okay? New Orleans was at the bottom. I'm still concerned they're going to be at the bottom till I see how the new scheme works. That kind of thing. Dallas was towards the bottom. Here's Dallas. But getting Dak back, does that help? Maybe it will. That kind of thing. New running back in Atlanta. Maybe that kicks it in. Think about all the new changes that have occurred and see what does that mean. If you're drafting Baltimore, boy, they don't like to pass. Look at that. One of the worst, if not, is it the worst? It's almost the worst, 2019. That and Detroit, they really sucked. Detroit came on 2020. Baltimore didn't. In PPR, I'd really worry about Baltimore players. I'm not really high on them in PPR. Standard, I'm fine. Okay. So, average targets per game. I just create a visual here. And on this side, 2020 versus 19, these are the teams that really increased and did well 2020. Here are the teams that didn't do well. So red is 2019, yellow is 2020. You can see who's above 2019. And we see about right here, it changes over. So most teams, it's asymmetric. Most teams did worse as a group. So these teams did better. These teams did worse. And here's the difference, shows that. But there's some extremes here that you need to be aware of. And I tried to mark those extremes for us here. Okay, so either side of the extremes. So again, can the teams that were in the bottom in 2020, are they going to turn it around? What's going on that is going to make that change, or is it going to be about the same? Definitely need to look at that in PPR. Okay. There's a lot of discussion, pros and cons, about when players are injured or move or retire, new coaches, things are happening. They call those vacated targets. When players left, did they leave those targets behind? We can debate that. I just like to see the data and make my own mind up, but you got to see the data first, not just esoterically saying, oh, I don't pay attention. I don't think anything in fantasy is like that to where you can just unilaterally sweep something across and say, oh, it doesn't apply. I'm not sure that's the case. It's hard to find something that's a universal kind of, all or none. Everybody, we like to say that when we're arguing, but well, you always do this or you never do that. And that's not true. Okay, there may be a tendency to go one way or the other, but it's never or all. So I think fantasy football is the same way. I think the pundits like to call things out Well, this never will happen or whatever, or this always happens. And I think drafters sometimes get pulled along by those terms. My dog's sounding the alarm here. So, vacated targets again. Uh, we see that these teams in green should have a lot more vacated targets than those in red. Again, it's the all or none phenomenon. We all have people saying this is all or this is, none. And that's probably not the case, but there's probably tendencies. And so I'm taking this data as a tendency, okay, that these teams running backs may pick up targets, these teams running backs may not. That's it. I'm not, 95. That means, for sure that 95 extra targets are going to be there with whoever's left. I'm not believing the data. I just think it's pointing us to trends and tendencies, and our further research for 2021, we need to use this data to think about who's there and what they're going to do and what the schemes are and the coaches and the schedule, all this. Is there teams that it looks like the vacated targets is going to be a nice little tendency and players are going to pick up targets, or does something say, no, that's probably not going to happen? You have to use your common sense with all metrics, okay? But I think it's important to at least have a starting point. Reference class forecasting, I've talked about that over and over. We've got to have a foundation and usually based on metrics first. And then we modify it based on other factors and thinking and putting things together and throwing things out. And, nobody's perfect at that, right? Nobody's perfect, but we're trying to model what we think is at least going to happen. So here's the tendencies here. I may have, yeah. So I predicted vacated targets, and we see here that these are the high teams. These are the low teams for targets. And so I would think the extremes would be where a lot of things could happen. Could. Not should, not will, not won't, just could. So keep this in mind when you're thinking about some of those players, making your draft notes, that there are this vacated targets concept, and that could, be something that adds a little luster or takes away from some players you're considering. That's how I would use this. I wouldn't, say, Carolina has 95 targets or whatever it is. It's got to be that way. No, it doesn't have to be that way. But it's, again, I use it as a tendency here. So this just shows the flow of where the vacated targets are based on players that are gone from the teams and what targets they left from 2020. Okay, so that's my first aspect of running backs. I've got another lesson on running backs coming up. So come back, think about what I just said. We're having lots of fun. This is Dr. Bush for The Process.